Hi everyone, welcome to Tech Talks. Today we're here to talk about the NISC axis and how a simple way of putting it is instinctive generalization. And so these are the SP types, so the ISTP, ISFP, ESFP, ESTP, and the NJ types, the INFJ, INTJ, ENTJ, ENFJ types. And so, Kyle, would you like to go a bit into that?
Yeah, I mean, like with all the cognitive functions, it's good to start with the basics. What are these things actually doing? So, at its core, extroverted sensing is a perceiving process. So, that means it is specifically gathering data. We have lots of other narratives and stories we put on these functions, but at its heart, that's what they're doing. Um, and so, extroverted sensing doesn't mean you're playing sports. Any function can be leveraged while we play sports. Extroverted sensing is specifically gathering that data. And it is like gathering the massive data that's tangible coming in at us and then using that with our decision making processes to make decisions. But the substance is that physical data that we're getting real time. And so extroverted sensing probably can be summed up the best as just being super direct and immediate and like noticing things, awareness, but physical awareness. So that's kind of what's going on at its heart. Introverted intuition, what's happening with introverted intuition, it kind of works together with extroverted sensing. So it's taking that data and now finding the patterns and the seeing the implications of it. Where is this going? What does it mean? All of these existential questions or meta questions. Again, anyone can ask meta questions, but its perspectives is specifically, or the introverted intuition is specifically taking that extroverted sensing data and then manipulating it or extrapolating it in a specific direction. So where is it going to lead? What does it come down to? It's kind of this narrowing down. Extroverted sensing is broad, introverted intuition narrows it down. A metaphor that I really like to use, it's just a metaphor, but it's a handy way of thinking of it, is those magic picture books from like the 80s and 90s, where it's like you have these little books and there's like fuzz all over the place, like tiny little black and white or whatever. I think there was even colors. Anyways, unnecessary detail. What happens is if you stare at the details, you just see the details. But if you look past the picture, past all of the fine data, suddenly an image will just pop out because of the way things are slightly off kilter. There's a science behind it, but that's kind of what's happening. Extroverted sensing user is getting lots and lots of physical data. You may not even be aware of it. In fact, if you're not paying attention to that data, it's much easier to see the patterns behind it. Different parts of the brain being activated kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of at the heart and how they work together as a start.
With introverted intuition, it boils things down. So it takes everything and then it kind of summarizes the essence of it, which is why it's a generalization. It's taking all of the sense data and then putting a theme to it, finding the best line of fit for it. This is the trend of it, or this is the trajectory of it. And that's why introverted intuition has the connotation of prediction with it, because when you're taking all this sense data and you're creating a pattern, you can take that pattern and you can project it forward and to see what does this tell me about this thing across time. Introverted intuition has this ability to forecast trajectories because of its ability to pattern recognize. It can take that pattern and then stretch it across time. And
Yeah, and I think the interesting part of that, want to contrast now that ability to forecast really makes a difference where it is in your cognitive function stack. So what I've noticed is the lower down it is in in the stack, the shorter those time frames get. So if you have, let's say, an SE dominant person using their introverted intuition, it can be like super short term, like a second ahead of time. It's that almost boils down to the reaction. It's like, where's that ball going to be in the next second? Where is that cake going to fall down? Like, when is that cake going to fall off of its unbalanced platter kind of thing? Like, it can get super short term. The higher up it goes, suddenly an introverted intuitive dominant is kind of simulating out what's going to happen 10 years down the road when they have 5 kids and a husband. Meanwhile, they don't have any of those things right now, but they're like almost living it in advance. That's kind of the time frames that they're going on, and it's comfortable doing that. Whereas if you ask a sensation driver to do that, is kind of like, why would you just make me guess, right? Whereas introverted intuitive person is kind of like, in those short moments, is kind of like, too much is happening at once. I don't have time to simulate all of this, because they want to do it on a little bit of a longer time frame. So it's a really nice contrast. When it's in the middle of your stack, they work together a little bit more. There's a bit more back and forth between this improvisation in the moment and the long-term planning. But you'll see more extremes when it's driver and 3-year-old character in the car.
Absolutely. And so introverted intuition is known for the phrase, I know it, I don't know how I know it, but I know it. And so it's sometimes hard to show your work. It can be equated to figuring out a math equation and having the conclusion, but having difficulty describing the steps. And so the details are foggy, but the thing that you arrived at, the moral of the story, is clear. And so sometimes NI dominant types can leave out context.
Right, and that's more when they're self-processing. I would say at the same time, introverted intuitive drivers are a little bit better than, let's say, extroverted sensor drivers at actually knowing what people need, what other people need in order to come to the same conclusion. So there's a little bit more, just to put a fine distinction on there. So a sensation driver will just also not be aware necessarily of what other people need to get to the conclusion. So they'll say something thinking, well, isn't this obvious? Like, we're seeing this right now together. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. The other thing I want to mention, though, when it comes to not knowing why I know something, there is another option. Just because you have that doesn't mean you're using introverted intuition. It can also, it's specifically referring to data gathering and the substance with which you are making decisions. It's not about the decision you're making itself. So another person that might say it could be an authenticity user when we're using introverted feeling or authenticity from Personality Hacker. What's going on is looking for resonance, and sometimes we just know, like, this feels right. I don't know how, but it's another instinctive like function that can seem similar, but it's specifically about conclusions, right? Whereas introverted intuition, we're kind of contrasting that with the other perceiving polarity, which is introverted sensing and extroverted intuition. That one we'll probably get into in a different video, but that one specifically is about knowing what the details are, starting with tangible details, and then extrapolating a direction with extroverted intuition, going into the possibilities, but it's holding those details quite strong. Whereas with the extroverted sensing, introverted intuition, it's like the flood of all of the data that we're not looking at the details, and then we're kind of narrowing down or getting that instinctive image that pops out. We're looking past that detail. And so that's what's going on when we say, oh, I don't know why. Sometimes introverted intuition could know why. But yeah, it's not necessarily all there. And especially if it's a decision, then they're leveraging their decision-making functions that could for sure know why. So maybe the one that knows the least is like NI, FI together. Even TI can be a little bit more like, this just doesn't make sense. They can't explain why, especially if it's with the NISE. So yeah, there's some complexity and nuance going on here. But at its base, that's kind of what we're seeing with that section, as opposed to any SI.
And so a lot of functions can look like other functions too. Like Kyle mentioned, FI can look like the NISE of just knowing something because it can have a guttural reaction to things too. And so Kyle mentioned some really good points there. He talked about how it is a perceiving process. The extroverted sensing is gathering the information, and the introverted intuition is processing the information, but they're both working with that information and they're not really coming to decisions with it. That's for the judging functions to do.
Yeah. So one thing that I've seen a lot in profiling and coaching that I've done is that it can be a big struggle for people to figure out where it is in their stack, because online often the stereotypes is just like, oh, if you are intuitive and can figure out where other people are coming from, then you are intuitive. But really what's happening is that these two functions in particular, well, the perceiving functions in particular, are always using each other no matter where they are in the car. Unlike the judging functions seem to be a little bit more separate at times. At least it can feel that way. If it's in certain spots. But with this, you are constantly using these two together, because even a sensation driver needs to know what all of this data means when they're in the moment, or like that's so interesting to all of us. So you are always using intuition when you're using sensation too, or the extroverted sensing. And so I don't know, I've just profiled a lot of people where it's like, oh, I thought I was intuitive. Now you're telling me I'm an extroverted sensing driver. It's because you are using intuition all the time, just on a shorter time frame. And it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just different. So I think the community needs to hear that message a lot, because extroverted sensing drivers are pretty cool. And they're given a bad rap in some of the stereotypes.
Yeah, and that causes, strangely, some SPs to mistype as NJs.
Yeah.
And so, Kyle, how would you tell apart those types? How do you differentiate a SE higher up type from an NI higher up type?
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff we already talked about in terms of the time frame of planning, how long we are planning out ahead of time. The other thing is just directness of speech. Like, the beautiful thing about sensors in general that have it as a driver, either introverted sensing or extroverted sensing, but you can really draw out what they're saying. So if they're describing something to you, especially if you're asking them to describe an experience or describe something tangible, it's actually pretty clear. Whereas you ask an intuitive, it can get so hung up on what it means, and then, or like, for extroverted intuition, what it's adjacent to. Extroverted sensing is pretty good. When you ask them a direct question, you'll get a pretty direct answer. They could go on and on and on too, because they're also kind of in the moment and improvising, but it's a very direct improvisatory style.
SP types tend to have a more direct language, and they tend to be more straightforward to the point, because that makes it more concrete when you're able to just explain it as it is. Whereas intuitives tend to, when they explain things, it's kind of esoteric, or NJs more. And sometimes that means not painting the picture so strongly.
Yeah, part of that directness of extroverted sensing also comes from the ability to be so in the moment and in this context. Then they're not worrying about the 15 other possibilities like NE, or they're not worried about like the long timeline or how everyone is receiving it. It's just, what am I seeing right now? What's my perspective? And they're very, very good at that. Like it's a high definition version that they can just provide. And it's just simpler because you're only dealing with the one thing. So
yeah. And so thank you so much today for coming out and sharing your wisdom on the NISE axis. And I think that it paints a clear picture to call it instinctive generalization, because there is this element of summing things up that it has, like taking all of that sense data in real time and then interpreting, what does this really mean? What is this really? Thanks, Kyle. You do a good job. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
All right. And so I hope you enjoyed watching, and I'll see y'all in the next episode. Bye.